Hello, welcome to the 50-Minute Hour. I'm Cory. Today I'm joined by Seraphim and Calvin. We apologize for the delay in the publication of this podcast. We did record it, but repeating an error of yore, we accidentally deleted it. So we are re-recording.
This time it's not my fault. I do want to
It wasn't
point
the
that out.
foot. It wasn't Seraphim's foot this time.
Today I am drinking some Côte de Rhône left over from a picnic we had on a very lovely spring day.
And I am doing the same.
And I'm having coffee. Trader Joe's brand, apparently. It's pretty good. I like it.
The morning blend or something to that effect. Well, the topic, again, is sort of a mixture of things. It's education, citation culture, academia, and all the problems thereof. I wanted to start off talking about some autobiographical aspects here, since in my early youth I was very involved in education reformation. I even went to the New School originally to study not so much psychoanalysis per se, but rather educational philosophy, which, by the way, I did want to mention, I did start a clinic recently in my own house in the ghetto. So patients daring enough to come and bear out their heroism in the neighborhood are all welcome to come to Royal Road Analysis.
What would be the best way to get in touch with that if you wanted to get an appointment?
Royal Road Analysis at gmail.com. I can, if need be, do a Skype session, but I don't generally encourage it. And so what I offer is psychoanalytic and psychodynamic therapy. I can't really give psychoanalytic therapy over Skype or something to that effect. I would need you here in person, but I could give psychodynamic therapy. And those who know me know that I lean Freudian, but I borrow from Lacan, Jung, everyone, so, and much more than just that, Dante, Plato. I sort of been putting this off. I did see patients when I was in New York City and when I was, a high schooler, even when I was here in Lexington. But this is a much more formal and officialized attempt, much in thanks to my friend Audrey, who did a lot of PR for me, free of charge. So now I have an actual business up and running. And I'm very cheap, $50 an hour for 50 minutes, $1 a minute. So like a massage for the soul.
And the brain.
And the brain. A brain massage.
So what is the main topic of the podcast today, and how do you want to address? You already mentioned education was your background. You did not.
Well, right. It was education is the main topic, and academia and all that. Right. So when I was young in high school, I did various things. I was very adamantly against things like testing, standardized testing, ACT, SAT. My experience was that there were a lot of very gifted people who, precisely because, not in spite of, but because of their giftedness, did not perform well on tests. Their brain, their mind, their soul was too active to really sit down and take a test like that. They were too creative. And then I saw people who, in my opinion, were basically stupid, but would get like 36, standardized testing scores or whatever, and probably score relatively well on the IQ test. I mean, Plato talks about these people in Republic. The Bloom translation says they're drones, people who are not, and we have to keep in mind what intelligent actually means for Plato, which is having a nous that connects to divine truths, which for him is actually stunted by what in our modern culture we would call a high IQ in some cases. Which is to say you could have a high IQ and also be very intelligent. But I think there's like a death valley at some point between 130 and like 200 where you kind of just go brain dead because you're too analytical. And anyway, what I started to realize, and why I gave up on reforming education altogether, realizing that the problem was way deeper, is that it's intentionally in a more egregore sense, standardized in such a way to promote the sort of people who are just intelligent enough to run the machine well-oiled, but not intelligent enough to actually start to question the system itself. And these are the sort of people who typically get into like Ivy League schools and become professors and the movers and shakers of the world, right? And if they want creativity, it's the sort of creativity you see promoted in a place like Silicon Valley. Like, what's this, new gadget or machine or way to rip people's souls out of their bodies mechanism. But it's not really like, why are we doing this to begin with? Because that would actually break the system down. So what I started to notice that from the very minutia of something like a test, this was built into the system. But what I was doing at that time was things like holding protest with students in the library when they were supposed to be doing some sort of standardized test. I remember the principal came and had like a public debate with me, and he didn't do very well because he was like asking these blue collar kids like, you know, what do you want to do when you grow up? And they were like, I want to be a car mechanic, and he was like, oh well, you need to take standardized tests for that. And these students were like, do I? I mean, like I could just like drop out and go become a car mechanic. I don't need a. And he didn't really have any response, and then. Because he didn't want to keep debating me because it wasn't making him look good. So then he started asking these students these questions, and it still didn't make him look good. So it was a tragedy. And I remember a lot of people, you know, it was controversial, and some teachers were like, "Well, I kind of appreciate what he's doing, but you know, he shouldn't be causing these disturbances." And another thing I did is that I shaved all my hair, and I did a reconnaissance mission in what's called GSP, which is a Governor Scholars Program. And it's something we do in Kentucky, where It's again, it's kind of like a pre-Ivy League sort of thing for Kentucky students where they get the sort of people who perform well on tests and they have them all come together. And I went there and it was in Danville, which is a terrible place. And I was living in the bushes in a tent that I brought. And I would go during the day to do all the stuff with the students. And it was kind of like a Socrates, and I would just ask them questions to sort of test my hypothesis that these students, for the most part, were stupid. And for the most part, my hypothesis was proven true. There were exceptions, but most of these students did not have any actual glitter behind the eye of their souls, so to speak. They had been just either they were born idiots or the education system had turned them into idiots despite their high standardized test performances. And eventually this guy who was like the manager or something, he like looked like Andy Warhol, but was like the polar opposite in terms of his personality, and had the police come get me. And I got a ride there from there back to so got a ride there from like some schizophrenic lady who had a personality for all MBTI personality types. She was going back and forth in between. And then I had to take the short bus with all the, you know, mentally handicapped kids back to Lexington. So it was kind of appropriate. And so that was an adventure. And then another time, so there was this thing they did in Kentucky. If you actually, someone told me, I think Sarah from you told me, if you Google my name, it's the first thing that comes up. And they misquote me or misparaphrase me. But it was like something where they got 12 students from around the state of Kentucky who were passionate about education, wanted to help reform education. I knew what they were looking for. So I was like, I want to help increase everyone's test scores, you know, in my application. You know, I told them the bullshit. And I got accepted, and which I actually didn't think was going to happen. So I went to the Capitol and started, you know, slowly saying like, well, I think we should abolish formal education altogether. I took my time, but, you know, I started with like, well, standardized tests aren't very reliable, blah, 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 blah. And eventually we started doing these things over Skype, and they would just mute me entirely. Not because I was even particularly annoying or talked out of turn, but I think they started to realize that some of the other students had some ounce of genuine care for education and were starting to become convinced by what I was saying. So they had to silence me in the meetings because they didn't want me corrupting the youth. And Seraphim wanted me to tell this other story about a painting I did. So basically, I didn't take health or PE, but you need those for requirements to graduate high school in Kentucky and get a GED. And I wanted to do more like elective classes or whatever, so I never took them. And then I was like, oh, I need to take these. So I took some online health course. And one of the assignments was to write an autobiography. And I told the teacher, like, it'd be very hard for me. Like, there's a lot of stuff that happened in my life. She's like, no, I want to hear it, blah, 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 blah. So I write it and I turn it in. And I can't log in for like a week after this. And then eventually I get some email saying the teacher had quit after reading my autobiography, that she was traumatized. And I was like, okay, that's weird. And then they started saying like I needed to go see a psychologist and that I needed to go to some social service people had to come visit in my house. And it was bad timing because my mother was about to go to prison. And all our apartment was just boxes. There wasn't, it looked disheveled. And the social service workers came in. There was this really cool black dude who looked and sounded like Morgan Freeman. And he was very understanding. He was like, okay, this is some weird bureaucratic bullshit going on. But then there was this girl who, she just looked she was like that Umbridge character from Harry Potter, who was very much the bureaucrat, and she was like very like she had to stick up her ass. And so I had to, and she was like, well, I want you to go see a psychologist. I didn't go see the psychologist. I talked for like 2 minutes and he was like, this is bullshit. I don't know why you're here. Here's a note. You're fine. Go away. And so I got all that resolved. I got my health credits. But the whole thing that happened, apparently, I later found out, there was this moment in my life where my father was being very violent and aggressive towards me. And I was very depressed. And I talked about this, the first oil painting I ever did called The Happy Man. And I have it hanging up in my symposium room. And it's just a picture of a sailor who's very happy on the board docks. And I did it with my friend Cromwell, who's now a Catholic monk of the Norbertine order. And it was, like I said, it was my first oil painting, and it was so joyful painting it. And we depicted him very happy and laughing. And I asked Cromwell, why is he so happy? Why is he laughing? This was like freshman year of high school. And he said, he just goes port to port raping the women. And I mentioned in the autobiography how I looked at that painting in that moment of crisis, and it gave me so much joy, and it gave me the free will to take fate into my own hands and leave my father and go be homeless. Or eventually I went to live in Cincinnati, and I made my way back to Lexington eventually. But the person who read this autobiography just ignored all that and just thought I was a rapist because I took joy in this painting depicting a rapist. Which wasn't even my idea in painting it. That was just Cromwell's interpretation of it. Which granted, he's like half the artist, so he's half a rapist. I don't know. In either case, the whole thing was extremely ridiculous, but it was so indicative of what I feel is the whole bureaucratic problem with teachers in general. I say this about psychology too. Like the vast majority of psychologists are idiots. This is the same way the vast majority of teachers are idiots. And that's why psychology, just like education, just like most tarot readers, right, for the most part, is a scam. That doesn't mean education or tarot or psychology is bad inherently. It's just the way we do it is an evil, So those are the stories I wanted to tell. And I guess where I would go from here is sort of firstly a critique of just the whole academic culture. And one in particular thing I wanted to talk about is this citation culture that we're obsessed with. And I think this is indicative of a sort of Apollinian. We're Apollinian in all the wrong ways and Dionysian in all the wrong ways. When we do the parties, our college parties, it's just getting blackout drunk and sex. There's no higher intellectual, artistic, or philosophical discussion. And then when we do the education part, the academia part, it's purely Apollinian. There's no, like in the European way, which part why I went to the new school, because I could do this with teachers. You get some wine, you drink, maybe smoke a little, and you're having a good conversation about whatever you're reading. But for the most part, American schools are very Apollinian. It's this obsessional, detail, Pharisaic aspect where it doesn't really encourage creativity, just a high-level specialization to the point of obscurity. And I think one thing indicative, like if you read Plato, and I talk about this in my Plato class, and I tell my students to pay attention to it. When Plato cites things like Homer or Pindar, you'll notice, and people who do translations will sometimes make a note of this for you, is that Plato's not citing these things correctly. He's changing words. And the only conclusion, because Homer's like the Bible, right, for the Greek culture at that time, which Plato Socrates is critiquing, right? But any person in that culture would know that what Plato is doing is intentional. It's not accidental. He's not making any citations. He's just, as Pindar says, right? Or as Homer says. And then he changes words around. So the whole idea is that it's actually an encouraged idea of creativity in the process of citing. There's not this strict need to do works cited page and all this bullshit. And like if you do a lot of academic stuff nowadays, especially in arts and humanities, it's all about citation to the point you don't really care about any aspect of the work at all, the actual substance. It's just merely being able to replicate what has already been said and graft it and accept it in academia. This whole thing is the word that Nick Land uses, right? It's the cathedral. It's like you can't question outside the bounds. And the whole purpose of academia is really to make it so you don't even have the language to ask the proper questions to think outside the box that is the cathedral. It's like Wittgenstein says, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. So it's like what all of academia is really doing is anti-academia. It's to disguise you from getting out of the cave. It's the exact opposite of Plato's academia. Let no man enter here ignorant of geometry. It's having the ability to actually begin with the basics and work your way up to the erotic, noetic understanding of direct apprehension of the truth beyond reason and beyond rationality altogether through divine eros. So it's not in any way the sterilized system of academia we have today. And I'm just bringing up citation culture because it's such a immediate, what's the word, phenomenological proof of this. Did you want to say something?
Well, I had a couple questions. I would think that the difference between you look in the past and, they're not obsessed with, again, the citations, so they're not obsessed with, misquoting, even to the fact of the tradition of often attributing someone
Yes.
else's words to yourself
Yes.
or your words to someone else.
Yeah.
And it seems like the reasoning, and then we get hyper obsessed with plagiarism, citation,
Yes.
and so on. And I think maybe it's because there's been a shift between, in the past, education was more about the expression of ideas and the sharing of ideas, and that was the fixation.
Yes.
Whereas now the fixation is on pure, raw, stoic fact. And it's like you
Yeah.
have to get to the citation, you have to get to the person who said it, and the whole idea is kind of just a secondary
Yes.
conclusion of whatever you're discussing the first time, and it's an inversion of whatever was going on in the past. How do you think that shift kind of came about?
Let me talk about this. But first, I don't even want to use the word stoic for two reasons. One, stoic is too noble of an adjective for it. And two is that it's not stoic at all. It's actually, modern academia is extremely emotional. The classrooms are very emotional. They have very little to do with reason or logic, even in the good sense.
Yeah.
It's extremely like, whatever my emotions are dictate what is true, as long as your emotions agree with the mainstream media and the mainstream academia, which for most students they're already programmed since kindergarten to think like that. So it's very rare you're going to get an opposition to that. Where this starts, in my opinion, is sort of a Catholicism and a scholasticism. You've probably heard me make this critique before in the podcast, so I won't go over too much in details. It really manifests in Kant. Kant is really the first academic philosopher. He is an actual academic teacher, and even his character is very much of this type. And Kant's philosophy is, one I've criticized in other podcasts, but even his very way of being. But up until this point, right, philosophy is really the gadfly. It's Socrates as being the gadfly that's waking up the sleeping horse of the polis to terrorize it. As Nietzsche says to Spinoza, he is that Jewish spider weaving his web of lies in which to catch the philosophical gadfly. And Nietzsche's honing it, and Nietzsche's sort of the last non-academic philosopher. He taught in academia at a very early age, but he's like, forget this, I'm out of here. And he was wise for doing so. And it's Nietzsche and Kant are such interesting foil characters in this respect because they represent two ways of doing philosophy. There's the modern way of doing philosophy, which is the Kantian academic cathedral way, right, to use Nick Land's term again. And then there's Nietzsche, who's like the anti-academic and someone who has sort of been castrated once he was accepted into academia so that students reading him don't actually understand him. To some degree, this is probably Nietzsche's own fault, but it's definitely a greater fault of academia and the way they've interpreted him. There's a character who's similar to Nietzsche, as Camus says, in the alleyway of nihilism, Nietzsche weeps where Stirner laughs. So Max Stirner never really got through academia. He was wiped out, eviscerated in memory 10 years after his death. In many parts thanks to Marx, who wrote a screed against Stirner that was greater than all of Stirner's works combined, calling him Saint Max. But Max Stirner has some philosophy very similar to Nietzsche, to the point some academics think that Nietzsche plagiarized Stirner, which again, who cares? But Stirner never really got through academia. And when he finally made an appearance only like 10 years ago, it was in like weird internet forums. And so he kind of bypassed academia. He was never really castrated the way Nietzsche was. And that's an interesting case experiment in itself. In either case, all this to say that academia, even if it takes a good philosopher, ruins him. They do this with Plato all the time, especially American academia in the whole Straussian school of interpreting Plato. But, or like Plato's myths are just like these worthless bygone aspects that Plato didn't actually think about. It was for the idiots, right? So I take the exact opposite view, which most Platonic scholars in history did, that the myths were actually the substantive core or root of Plato's philosophy, that Plato is a philosopher of faith, which is so antithetical to modern academia. In part, that's a reaction to Christianity, but it's also a reaction to Eros. And Plato's idea, if you especially read Phaedrus or the Symposium, is that Eros is the beginning and end of philosophy. Reason or dialectic is just the medium through which we get from point A to point B, from ignorance, aporia, to enlightenment, which in some ways are the same thing. And academia hates this idea. It hates the idea of Eros in education, which is true passion. It's not fake passion. The reason eros is dangerous is because it's insane. It doesn't abide by the laws of whatever media you're trying to force emotion into. Eros is connected to the divine eternal truths. Therefore, it's not controllable. And that's what academia doesn't like about it. So whenever eros appears in a student, it takes it and corrupts it and makes it into pure childish emotion that attaches itself like a child in need of a parent to the teat of the media, of the academic truth that you really aren't allowed to question. And like, again, the word Nick Land uses is so good here because it is a cathedral. It's this the whole dynamic of what that implies. It's a dogma. It's something that you can't even see outside of. There are no stained glass windows in that cathedral. Or if there are, they're reflecting the dark sun, right? The dark light, the moon. In either case, this is all to say that very manifestly why academia is so antagonistic, which Plato was very much a champion of something like the erotic relationship between the student and teacher. Now, that doesn't mean sexual. And if you read Plato, you understand it's explicitly not sexual. In fact, the sexual aspect ruins it. And this is, again, why I say Plato and Freud are saying the same thing, that sexuality is just a manifestation of eros. When Freud is saying sex or sexual energy, we have to understand it in a much deeper level. Not necessarily metaphysical, right, because he's an atheist. But you can definitely take Freud that way if you want to. But a much deeper sense in a merely physiological, primal sense that eros manifests everywhere, among which is genital sexuality. And this is often lost in English translations from Strachey. But in either case, that there is a passionate, intense relationship of love between the teacher and student that is needed in order to inspire the eros, both in the teacher and the student, for the student to be enlightened. And that is totally quashed. Or if it is manifest in modern academia, it usually becomes sexual. Where Plato's whole idea was allowing it to foster, but not permitting it to become sexual.
Can you speak to the idea of the midwife of ideas relating to that?
Right. This is why I say Socrates is the first psychoanalyst. If you read Theaetetus, he says that his mother was a midwife and his mother helped women deliver children. But he says men are different. He says that I'm a midwife to men. And what he means by that is that he says men also become pregnant. But whereas women become pregnant with flesh, men become pregnant with nous, with ideas. And he says the difference is also that when a woman is pregnant with flesh, she becomes aware of her pregnancy. A man will be pregnant all his life and never give birth and never be aware of the nous within him. And Socrates' job as being a midwife to men is that he uses dialectic to help them have a painful delivery through aporia of the truth within them. Because again, this is Plato's whole point with education. There's a wonderful book on this, by the way, by Nettleship called Plato's Philosophy of Education in the Republic. And another book that might be interested to those finding this topic of interest is Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, who was a Platonist. But in either case, or any of A.S. Neal's books. But right, so in either case, this concept with, sorry, I'm forgetting my train of thought, remind me.
About the midwife of ideas.
Midwife of ideas. So again, Socrates delivering the child through dialectic, through psychoanalysis, basically, that there is something within you already, that education is not out there in the world, in the cosmos. This is very much the Cartesian view of education, right? The modern view of education, that education is something out there, that there are facts out there that we have to put inside of you. The Platonic idea of education, which is much more etymologically true to the word, educare, to lead you out of what? The cave, Plato's cave. That there is something inside of you. There's an eternal truth that is not outside of you, which is mostly illusionary and changing. The truths out there change. The law, and what's in here is eternal. It's connected to the nous, which is connected to the divine. It's very much in line with like Augustine, right? Men search forever for meaning and truth outside without ever looking inside themselves. That the exterior is actually a distraction for the interior, which is very telling because modern education is all about the exterior. It has very little to do with the interior.
Well, we had this conversation, similar conversation the other day, and we were talking about this, and you had said modern education is contraceptive. Instead of helping be a midwife of ideas, it's contraceptive to ideas. Yeah. And I said, I think it's even worse. It's not contraceptive. It's abortive. It's abortive. Yeah. Because if you have this originality, and I think, in some of your stories in education, this seemed to happen to you a lot. I was spared of it quite a bit. I was very fortunate in some of my education, but it's like if you start to have derivative ideas, that will be immediately shut down. And I think that's a big part of the point of, and not that there shouldn't be ideas that are taught, But like, I think that is the point of being so facts-based, being all crazy about standardized tests and stuff, is to really contain what the conversation is, and not letting people actually give birth to that unique idea inside of them.
Right. And I don't even think there's anything wrong with dogma. I think the worst thing about dogma or ideology is that dogma is inevitable. What becomes problematic is when we start to think that we aren't dogmatic. That is the true dogma, and that's exactly what modern academia is. Like, we're not dogmatic. We use science. We use facts. Right. We don't rely on religion. And I think the irony, as I mentioned in other podcasts, is that, I have critiques of science both under the Catholic Church and under secular capitalism. But I think science, in the true sense of that word, fared much better under the thumb of the Catholic Church than it does under modern capitalism. And that sounds probably crazy to a lot of people who aren't actually involved in scientific research. And I'm sure even then a lot of them would disagree. But speaking with my scientist friends, they understand what I mean when I say that, when they understand how much of what you do in science is under the thumb of getting funding. And therefore, how often, even by prestigious professors at Harvard, research results get fudged intentionally to get the right funding. And once you have entered that world, how skeptical and cynical you become of whatever is reported in scientific journals. Much to say nothing of pop science, how that gets transmitted between the scientific journal to the news or the media about, science discovers this, blah, 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 bullshit. Right. So it's like 4 degrees removed of separation. And even then, again, right, that's concerned the outside world, which is changing, not the internal world of the divine, because we are divine beings that connects us to the eternal truths of reality. Modern education is, and it's not like this division between public and private schooling either. They're all bullshit. And in fact, I think in many cases, your child's better off at public school because they're not going to be as brainwashed into the system as they will in a private school. But in either case, the other aspect here I wanted to mention with the whole citation, the ancient culture, G.K. Chesterton says something to the effect that when you take the gods out of the sky, they become idols of the earth. And that's very true here with truth. And we talked about truth and going beyond truth and good and evil in these past podcasts. What I mean here is that there wasn't this ideology, right? This non-dogmatic dogmatism that we have in modernity of such a thing as like unbiased news. Like, everyone was not, at least in this respect, historically, people were remarkably not idiotic about this. By which I mean, they knew everything was already mythological. There was no factual statement of history or the facts. And because of this is exactly why no one batted an eye when someone obviously, distorts the truth in regards to these historical things to make them myths, or signs a document that they didn't write under their name. Or for that, this is a big scandal nowadays with a lot of Orthodox, right? When you bring up St. John of Damascus, who was living in Damascus, he writes this screed against Islam. And by the way, Damascus, very few minority Christians, Jews, mostly a Muslim city. John of Damascus is not writing this to Christians in Damascus. He's writing this to Christians outside of Damascus about why Islam is this evil religion. But any person who has any ounce of understanding of Islamic history, definitely any Muslim person at that time would know that John of Damascus is totally wrong about everything he says. And so the question that arises to a Christian who understands Islamic history is Damascus just an idiot? Is he ignorant? And it can't be that, because he was living with Muslims in day-to-day life.
I think he worked for the court.
Right. So he would. So basically what you have to derive at is that he's telling a lie. He's doing propaganda. And a lot of modern Christians are scandalized by that. But I think that's interesting because that wouldn't have been scandalizing to either Muslims or Christians at the time, because everyone did that. Damascus just doing it up to a higher degree than most people probably did at the time. And there might be fault in that. I don't know. But in either case, I think it's interesting how scandalized people are today, because the whole idea of truth has changed. It wasn't that. Basically, the idea in the past was that no one's going to get these details right because we're all fallen, we're all sinful, we're all going to distort the truth. So just embrace that in order to get the higher truths correct. This is very much Plato's idea with deliberately changing what he's quoting from Pindar or Homer, right? This is not an innovation of Plato. This is something everyone does, right? Whereas nowadays it's the exact opposite. It's basically the Kantian nominal truths are impossible to attain. So we'll just rely on phenomenal truth, and we put all our effort into getting that right, which incidentally just makes it more dogmatic and therefore incorrect, in my opinion, compared to this culture that just understood that as always being dogmatic from the get-go. And therefore mythological. Now we have this idea where myth is false and history is true. It was the exact opposite of ancient culture or classical culture, where mythology was actually higher than history. I talked about this in the myth of history podcast too. But So the whole scandalization of a modern person seeing these sort of things is so telling to how far we've fallen from understanding the higher truths of the hierarchy as being higher, rather than the lower truths of everyday out there things. Because it's the higher truths that are divined in the inner part. The outer truths, the exterior truths, it's not that they're unimportant, but they're distracting. They're distracting, and they're often illusionary. When you look at science throughout history, basically up until Spinoza, the goal of science, as we understand, that is to say, looking at the modern world, seeing observations, to collecting data, making theories about the world. The whole purpose of that was understanding the below in order to understand the above. Because the idea is that, for instance, in alchemy with the planets and the corresponding metals in Earth, is that they all respond to an allegory of man in the middle, in the man's soul, in the composition of man's soul. Jonathan's talked about this in other podcasts. And the idea was that insofar you're a scientist, and if you look at Newton, you look at Tesla, even Einstein to some degree, though not as much, or Galileo for that matter, is very evident that Newton's notes are doing all the science that we rely on today, and to some degree, we've kind of moved on also. But in either case, a large portion of science was relying on Newton for a while. And Newton's whole thing had very little to do with actually getting there. These were just like sub-notes for him doing alchemy and theology. And this is the way you understand science historically, is that science was in service to the above, to the higher empirical truths. You look at someone like Pascal, even more remarkably, and a lot of modern historians of science say that Pascal faked all his scientific experience, or a good portion of them, which is remarkable and actually only speaks to Pascal's intelligence, because he's so, one, his results are very accurate and they're way ahead of his time in regards to actual, in our idea of the word, scientists who were doing real experiments. Pascal was sort of just doing it from noetic mathematical apprehension and still getting very accurate results, even though he was fudging it because Pascal didn't really care about the empirical reality. The empirical reality, as for any other scientist at that time, was to tell a higher truth about the above. Science is like, modern science is now like a little twig of a branch of a branch of a trunk of a tree, that we've cut off everything but that little twig, and we wave this around like it's a wand of divine truth.
And funnily enough, a wand of divine truth against the very tree. And they've now
exactly
put it as the opposition of
yes.
everything else, which is insane.
If you read Heidegger's very brilliant little essay, "What is Metaphysics?" he gets into this with being itself as the ground that the tree of knowledge fosters itself from. But yeah, right. We've used this divine law. We're so arrogant in modernity that we think we have all this knowledge and we're so ahead of all the ancient people. And I think one of the most disturbing truths that you start to learn when you really get into history is that the ancient world actually knew a lot more. Even technology, by our definition, technology, things like Atlantis or batteries in Egypt or whatever, that they actually knew a lot more. One, than we give them credit for, but even more than we know now. There may be, Evola says, like, he grants that modernity probably knows more about scientific facts about medicine and microbiology. He grants that, but he says basically in every other category, modernity is dwarfed in its knowledge of the world. And it's ironic because it's like we've put all our devotion into the outer world. The ancient world didn't even really care about the outer world that much, and they were still more advanced in it.
Well, and not to restructure this podcast into magic, but this goes in conversations I know we had recently, which is like, it's like, well, if they didn't know about batteries and stuff in Egypt, if they didn't know about electricity and stuff, amongst kind of as the hidden knowledge, then, why didn't they make the light bulb? And it's like, well, maybe they, because they recognize the power of it and because they associated it. And this goes back to our magic episode, right? A few episodes back, like because they saw the magic in it and the power of it, they knew not to do that. Whereas in modernity, where anything goes and technological progress for the sake of technological progress and nothing else is desired, then there is none of that caution, and there is none of that kind of deeper knowledge of it, which is what is very, very scary.
Right, we don't have the wisdom for the technology. And if you read Tesla's personal notes, he was very hesitant about letting his discoveries, quote unquote discoveries of electricity becoming too public because he thought it was too dangerous. Einstein had felt the same way with a lot of what he discovered. And this was just natural intuition to everyone doing science or alchemy or whatever, magic, for most of history. There's a really good essay on this by a very fringe Catholic thinker, Solange Hertz. Ironically, her last name's Hertz, who wrote this essay called Hell's Amazing Grace that is all about electricity being known from basically ancient times, like Book of Enoch, angels giving men, writing and blacksmithing, and electricity, right? And magic, right? Like it was there from the get-go, right? And man has always had this power, but has been wise enough to kept it secret. When we break that point with Kant, that point with thinking democratization with Protestantism, anyone can read the Bible, everyone should be able to read, which I don't even think that's good right now. Modern education, 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic. Thank you, Calvin. Like, actually, I don't think anyone, really very few people should know either of those. Like, when education became democratized and publicized, that was like really the death knell of it.
Well, kind of going back to education, and also talking about how we don't know as much, as people from the past. I mean, even if you want to talk about the quality of education, right? Of just today versus a couple hundred years ago, of just of what you're coming out. I mean, right now we have basically you go into the system when you're like 2-3 years old, at least in preschool, right? Okay, maybe you're not really learning anything in preschool, but you're already there in the system.
But the indoctrination's already begun.
Exactly. And now you're going it for up until, I mean, these days, for most people this generation, it's just a given you have to go to college. So basically up until you're 22. That's at least a quarter of your life. I mean, if you're lucky, and that you're in the system. What's amazing is how you're supposedly learning all these things, right? And you're sitting there, like 40 hours a week, 30 hours a week, most weeks out of the year under these fluorescent lights, just getting indoctrinated. What's really interesting is you're coming out of that and you see the quality of the education a lot of people get, where you are actually graduating like high school without even being able to read. Some people are, and it's like, well, then what the hell is the point? And I think about just something that strikes me is you go back just a couple hundred years, right? And we're supposed to be so advanced. To I was reading correspondence between John Adams and his son John Quincy. Two of probably the most educated presidents we've ever had. Certainly John Quincy is probably the most educated. And here this boy was at 12 years old. And he went to like schools in Europe and he studied in Denmark for a time. And he was 12 years old, writing his father about his studies. And he says, oh yeah, I'm reading Thucydides right now. Who reads Thucydides anymore?
But he was reading in the original Greek.
And then John Adams responded to him and said, it's very good. You should be reading Thucydides, but you need to be doing it in the original Greek. Let me go send you a copy. And the boy went and did it. Now, of course, even at that time, John Quincy was, again, very well educated for someone of that time. But it's like we have democratized education so much that it's like, well, and we get the like No Child Left Behind thing. Well, everyone needs to learn, and everyone needs to learn the same thing. And so then the people that are you're hurting both people. You're hurting the people who really weren't built for that and don't like that and are getting their souls crushed because they're being made to do things that are against their nature. At the same time,
they feel stupid because they're not good at it.
It affects their worth because their worth is tied to their grades and their scores. And we have the society that
you have like 15-year-olds killing themselves because they're doing bad in school.
Yeah, and I mean, you see that. I mean, you think it's bad here. You see that it's far more bad in places
China.
in Asia. And so then the people who are meant for it, people
get weighed down.
Certainly like you, Cory. I think I relate a lot to this. Who had that passion, that interest.
That happened to me a lot.
Get it killed.
I couldn't do what I actually wanted to study.
Right. Because you're getting weighed down. Whereas both people would be far happier and far more within their nature to be able to have an education that isn't so formalized, that isn't so democratized, and that we can kind of do away with this notion of everyone needs to go through all this bullshit.
Yeah, this goes to another truth that modernity doesn't really like, and which is basically that we are not created of equal natures. And the funny thing is like there's nothing wrong with that, and the ancient world understood this. Plato talks about it immensely in the Republic. I mean, Ayn Rand, say what you will about her, but she's basically correct when it comes to education. And even Plato, you look at, modern people like Karl Popper will look at Plato and be like, he's fascist. Other people look at Plato's Republic and say it's communist. Well, it's funny because when it comes to the philosopher king's education, right, the philosopher kings end up living basically a monastic communistic lifestyle. But their education is incredibly capitalistic in the sense that, not capitalistic in the modern sense, but in the sense it's like, everyone else, like, you don't even need formal education. You just need to play around for 12 years. The vast majority, you're going to become farmers, blacksmiths, even lawyers or merchants. Well, they don't really have lawyers because they don't have written law. But in either case, even with a lawyer, right, for most of history, this was true with lawyers, is that you don't go to formal school to study law. You find a lawyer and you train them. Even with doctors, under a doctor. You don't go to school for a doctor. You find a doctor and you train with them. Want to be a blacksmith? Find a blacksmith. Want to be a car mechanic? Find a car mechanic. There wasn't this need for formal schooling. And we've convinced everyone, including ourselves, that this is some weird necessary requirement to read and do arithmetic. Any arithmetic or reading you would need for any of these jobs, you'll learn from the apprenticeship. The guild system was way more intuitive and intelligent than this whole modern democratization thing. And the problem is that we're not tabula rasa. We're not these blank slates of the Enlightenment. We have natures that are endowed with us. You can think of this from whether you want to be this materialist evolutionary perspective or a more Platonic metaphysical or Christian sense. In either case, there are very, 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 very few people who are meant to have a formal education. And they're basically the people who are meant to be politicians, kings, philosophers, and priests. Everyone else, you just go and find an apprenticeship.
And it's funny because, like, let's even take the lawyer, like you said, right? I mean, look at the formal education that comes with it, right? So now, today, you have to go through 12 years of high school, 4 years of college, 3 years of graduate school to become a lawyer, right? Take a constitutional lawyer of today, like your average, guy, or even a really good one, someone that comes out of Harvard or, Yale, right? Pit them against any one of the founding fathers. And it's like, okay, and they were formally educated. Like, they usually went to like Harvard at like 14, 15 for like 2-3 years. So like, and then about 18, they went to
which wasn't really even for the purpose of being educated for law the way we think of it
right,
today.
Yeah. And it was a far shorter kind of time. And then they went and they trained under, as an apprentice, for 3 years. And then they sat for the bar and they became lawyers. And it's like, by all standards, far less educated in terms of the amount of time. And you read the things they write, and you're just like, these people, and it's not just one or two. It's not just Adams and Jefferson, I mean, it's any of these guys that you can just start reading, and it's like they knew so much and they learned so much, and they weren't doing it in this stupid, rigorous 20 something year setting to get there.
Another thing is the specialization, which you were talking about earlier. My girlfriend, she's in accounting and she wants to be an accountant, and she's going to spend, all the years of high school, the 4 years of college, and then an additional several years studying for the CPA exam and everything. And she'll become an accountant, and she will really only be trained in a very, very, very specific thing, which she hasn't even chosen yet, and she's almost done with college. But I mean, it's my parents say, oh, she can do our taxes. No, she can't do our taxes. She's only going to know how to, audit a specific type of company in a specific location. It's very, very specialized. And it seems like just the amount of time is so unnecessary, especially because you start to consider that a lot of these jobs, you still have to do an apprenticeship after college. You get the degree, and then you take some sort of internship where they just have you shadow.
Unpaid internship.
Yeah. That's how you actually get trained for the job, or that's how they hire you, is if they like you when you work. So what is the point of that?
Yeah, there's way too few resources of actual teaching to deal with the democratic view of education that everyone needs to go into formal education. If we were like Plato or the ancient world that actually had this idea that very, very few people are meant to be formally educated, we wouldn't have this problem of having 10 people who want to be lawyers to one lawyer, or probably even more than that. And therefore, we could easily do something like an apprenticeship. That's not just an internship where it's like a bunch of people wanting to do this job with working with like a few people who aren't really even interested in their education. I'm sure most people in internships will tell you that most of it is bullshit. It has nothing to do with the actual thing they're trying to learn. So the whole thing is just like I was saying at the beginning. It's a scam. It's like a prison to keep kids in not even an intellectual sense, just merely to keep them out of the way of parents doing their capitalism. And then secondarily, it is an intellectual prison. It is the cathedral that is meant to indoctrinate them so they don't even have the language to ask the questions, to think outside of the box. If you read Orwell's actual nonfiction essays, he talks about this, how as academia and the world becomes more industrialized, that education and words themselves will have to accommodate change to make it so that people don't even have the vocabulary to ask the right questions that would challenge the system, which I think, especially nowadays in the past 20, 30 years, you can, maybe even 50 years, you can already see that, something like the CIA creating the word conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. Like, it's like the very introduction, it's very much like the art of what is it in Orwell's 1984, the Ministry of Truth, right? The very idea of inserting words into the lexicon to program people about how to think about things.
Now we've got about 7, 8 minutes left. So I wanted to ask you, what would be your kind of ideal school if you were to just create from the ground up a education? What would it look like?
Yeah, if in today's world I was giving a lot of money, I thought about this a lot when I was in high school, or even college. When I had downtime, I would make notes about my perfect idea of curriculum. And just working with an all-boys school, I'm really not into the idea of unisex education, but there's already a lot of books written on that, so I won't go into too much on that. But an all-boys school, basically our version of K through 12. I would put it way outside of any city. I put it in nature, in the mountains or something. And the boys go to live there, for several months of the year. And the classes, so kind of like I have critiques of Montessori, but at least in this aspect, I'll borrow from them. You'll have older boys teaching younger boys and younger boys with older boys. And it'll be very like, not like this grade thing, like you're in this grade, so much as everyone's sort of working together. I'll have 2 basic tracks. There will be a more intellectual academic sort of track and then a more vocational track. But each boy is doing one from the other. And in either case, a lot of the classes are taught outside. And it's this idea of basically being Boy Scouts, but not as gay, where you go out and you have the teacher and maybe a few older boys who are teaching it's like you find wood, you find a pig, you kill the pig, you eat it, you take the gut, you make a bow with that and the wood you got, you go out and kill some turkeys or something. That's what you eat with your boys at dinner that night, right? So it's very much like learning the aspects of how to be a man, basically, but also integrating anything you're studying academically into nature itself. So it's like you're reading Thucydides, you're reading Homer, you're reading Plato, while reading this outside, out loud with your fellow students, right? Going page by page and really trying to understand what's being said. Learning, by the way, the classical Greek and Latin necessary to read those for real, is that you're actually being adventurous and you're actually out there sort of like Odysseus, and all incorporating this need for adventure. I mean, one of the worst things that modern education does for boys is keeping them trapped in this desk space, and they all get diagnosed with ADHD and loaded on all these drugs. And it's like boys are meant to, and even girls, but especially with boys, they aren't meant to be sitting down trapped like that. They're meant to be out in the world, exploring, touching, fighting, doing things that guys do like that. And that actually is good for their learning process. And modern teachers have been trained to look at that and say, this is antithetical to their learning. They're being distracted. Like they can't be fighting. It's like, no, a boy's very mind is grafted with education into the process of fighting, into the process of being a hero, into the process of adventuring, into the process of living out these stories, right? That's a natural way that a boy develops. And every culture historically understood that. And they had all these initiatory rituals meant for boys to be brought into manhood that our culture no longer has. That's why we have a bunch of basically every boy, every guy, including myself, has a sort of stunted development because we never had a proper initiation. The closest thing in modern culture to initiation is college, which actually effeminizes boys. It effeminizes men, intellectually and physically, because the effeminate intellectual is not caring for any actual ultimate truth, just ways of debating and rhetoric, sophistry.
Well, I actually wanted to kind of leads into a few things I wanted to touch on. One, there seems to be this modern idea of, right, like the jock and the nerd, right? The dumb, physical kind of manly jock, the kind of scrawny, effeminate, weak nerd. And it's like you go and you look at like Plato, right?
Yeah.
Quite literally look at Plato.
Yeah, literally his name meaning broad shoulder.
Broad shoulder,
wrestler.
yeah. Who is this wrestler and who talks about how important it is for the mind and the body to both be fit.
Do gymnastic and music.
And we have this idea, which I think does exist, of sort of the intellectuals in the ivory tower, right? Kind of, trapped away from the world. But that was never what education was meant to be. That it should be integrated, and it's important that it is.
And this is precisely Evelyn's point that all ancient cultures understood the natural leader was the warrior poet, the warrior philosopher, the one who incorporates both religion, poetry, or what we would call academia, and being a badass warrior who can kill a ton of people with the jawbone or something, right? And you are all of these, right? And the purpose of education in the ancient world was to produce precisely that, to produce the warrior, philosopher, priest, king. Anything else, you just became an apprentice for. And Plato's whole republic is built around that archetype. And whereas now we split everything, we've divided everything, we specialized everything. You have the nerds and the jocks or whatever, right? But it's actually, no, the nerd and the jock are meant to be one and the same.
One thing I wanted to say quickly, I think this kind of sums up the inefficiency of education in America, at least. So we've talked about how long they're in school, how many hours over their life you're in school, taking health classes and physical education. Yet over the past 40 years, childhood obesity rates have more than quadrupled. Now that 17.4% of children are clinically obese, and 13% of children 2 to 5 are now obese. Just the fact that they can spend so much time where they're supposedly exercising with some sort of coach and learning about health. And now topics about can you say fat are popular in pop culture. You know, is it fat as healthy? We've regressed even with all the education in that situation.
And again, the truth modernity doesn't want to face is that health is not something you just teach. It's the very way of life and culture within a polis, within a city state. It is something integrated into the fact that for instance, Greek culture, you just went every day to the gymnasium to talk with people, and you were working out naked with your friends and bros and chilling, and you were, I guess, kind of lifting weights and doing the Bowflex or whatever. But you're doing this as a way to hang out. Like health and it's not something you just teach in a class. It is a very way of life. And the problem is that no matter, you could turn all schools into doing nothing but health and PE classes, and I don't think the problem would improve, because at the end of the day, our life and culture focuses around being a desk jockey who is doing all this bureaucratic work and being on the computer or watching TV or whatever, right? And that's just our way of life. Like unless you're, some person like a physical athlete or something. Which is to say the entire world, because at this point everyone is American. The way of life of the modern world is not conducive to a healthy lifestyle. Industrial society is not conducive to a healthy lifestyle. I mean, read Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber Manifesto, right? Industrial society in its future, and he tells you precisely why that is.
Yeah, actually, this kind of goes back to some degree to what you sort of mentioned earlier, which was how the modern academy is Dionysian in all the wrong ways and Apollonian kind of all the wrong ways. And I think they feed into each other, right? The more you get the kind of rigidity and strictness and structure and coldness of the classroom, the more you get into the wild debauchery frat party, and how much great it would be, again, if you could merge them and not go to excess and this is, again, how it worked with Plato at the symposiums, and what you see, in the Republic and in the symposium of them lounging and drinking and discussing great ideas. And it's like the party is the classroom. You even see that with, and I know we're wrapping up here, but even in the Gospels with Christ, it's like, yeah, he gives the sermons, to the thousands, but when he's with his closest followers,
the Last Supper,
who's giving the biggest truths and teachings, it is in the context of a feast, the Last Supper, the wedding of Cana, being in the houses of his followers. And I mean, there's a number of instances of Christ being at basically these grand parties, is what it would have been. And we've so separated that. And I think about my own education, and I always learned more when it was me at the house of a professor or something, and we were outside of the actual classroom. We were getting so much more discussion done and having so much of a better time learning things when we weren't even supposed to be in the learning at that time.
And that's the most practical thing to do in this situation, because modernity's fucked. Like there's no help for it. But it's like, as an individual, what can you do? It's why I've been doing symposiums for the past 12 years or so. It's like, you integrate the Apollonian in the Dionysian. It's Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, right? You had to integrate them together. And that's, if you want to do that in your own life, have symposiums, have people read Plato or poetry or whatever, and then drink and, get a little fucked up over it and have a good discussion. Like your party should be your education and vice versa.
All right. We have reached the end of the 50-minute hour. Any closing remarks?
In the words of Jefferson Airplane, feed your head. Until next time.
Jefferson Airplane.
Yeah, is that what it's called?
JJ the Airplane?
No, Jefferson Airplane. It's a band from the 60s.
Oh, I thought you were talking about, do you remember that cartoon, JJ the Airplane?
Oh, wait, is it that weird fever dream one with the
yeah, the blue little plane with a face?
I try not to remember that.
I thought Cory was quoting that.
No.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Until next time.